that broad background, I'll go ahead and get started. All right, so a little background on instructional materials. So the law was passed. The law provides $324 million of new formula funding on top of the IMA. And so this is a subject of some confusion. We'll return to this topic later on in the presentation, but there's $1 billion of the IMA. I'm assuming everybody here is familiar with the IMA. It was appropriated sort of at the levels pre-COVID. On top of that, and this bill actually didn't really change that at all. On top of that, this bill created 2 new formula funding entitlements in the foundation school program that work a lot like the IMA, but they're not the IMA, and should net out to about $324 million of additional funding per year, or almost $700 million over the biennium. And so if you think about that, there was $1 billion per the biennium for districts to purchase instructional materials before the law. There's almost $1.6 billion, $1.7 billion after the law. There's more involved than just the funding to school districts to purchase instructional materials. There's also some training funding in there, and a few other components that are like grant funds. But this is the big portion of what 1605 has done for districts. So the next slide, the 3 big things center field to this SBOE's authority, and there's a few things in 1605 that are not necessarily SBOE, but what we're going to talk about today is the same stuff that we talked about from the SBOE. It generally replaces the proclamation process that has been in place for the last decade, with the term that we're using is the Instructional Materials Review and Approval Process, or IMRA. And we're going to spend a lot of time today talking through that. It also requires the SBOE to go back, reopen up the ELAR TEKS and add to them. They don't actually have to edit them, but they will have to add to them a vocab list and a book list. And there's some other sort of implications of TEKS revisions. And then for parental transparency, it created a requirement that publishers provide a parent portal on products that are being sold in Texas. And the important thing is not so that everyone looks at it, but for your customers that are school districts, their enrolled parents can access the materials through those parent portals. And there's some related transparency tools related to local curriculum, local instructional materials that are used in classrooms that are set up. So these are like the 3 big buckets of things that the bill does. And again, we're going to get into the details on each of these in a bit. So in terms of why did we get here, like our the broad policy landscape. So in the lead up to session, there were some interim hearings done by the legislature on this, a lot of debate by the legislature during the session on this. But the sort of broad policy framework that we think about in public education, at least the way that sort of we see it here at the agency, is you got TEKS, you got the standards. These are the bones that the entire system is built on. But kids are not taught standards directly. They're taught lessons, they're taught text. They have individual daily experiences with their teachers. And so you can think about that as instructional materials. The shorthand for that is textbooks. Textbooks, there's usually more than just a textbook. So there's textbooks, sometimes there's manipulatives, there's the paper mache volcanoes, there's all the stuff that's the instructional materials, the teacher's guides. Sometimes there's look-fors for instructional coaches. There's lots of stuff for instructional materials, but we're going to shorthand that as textbooks. And then teachers do their stuff, the art and science of teaching, to deliver that content each day, with students to manage discipline, manage classroom, and ensure that the eager minds are learning the content. And then at the end of the year, at least in 3 through 9 in reading and math, you get a state assessment on it, state summative assessment, which is STAR, and then of course you have TSI and a few other things in Texas as well. So this is your sort of basic architecture. So if we go specifically to textbooks, instructional materials, I talked a little bit about this, like what is instructional materials? People use the term to mean a variety of different components. But if you think about the full complement of what a teacher needs, a full complement of what students will learn from, it is someone has made an editorial scope and sequence determination from the TEKS. So you start with the standards. Then you build unit plans and sort of summative assessments tied to specific units of knowledge and skill. You build lesson plans, so daily interactions, and just all the formative assessments that the kids have interacting with that lesson. And then the content resources associated with the lesson. So if we're in English language arts, it would be common to see a novel. If you're in math, there might be shapes that you're manipulating. If you think about in phonics, sometimes there's tiles that kids are moving around. There's all the content resources that people, and since we're now, super fancy in modern America, there's videos, there's all kinds of content resources that can be featured. So this is the breadth of what would theoretically be encompassing a set of instructional materials. And so then the history of this is before 2011, textbooks went to the SBOE for approval. The SBOE approved those textbooks, and that's basically what districts used. There was, at some point in time, there was actually central procurement and drop shipping of it. Over time, it got sort of allocational. Foundation subjects are treated a little bit different than enrichment subjects, but the SBOE was really the decider on the textbooks that were used in Texas classrooms pre-2011 for, I don't know, 100 years. So between 2011 and this most recent legislative session, what happened was the authority was devolved to school districts, and they would no longer need to buy off of the SBOE's list. The instructional materials and technology allotment was given to school districts, and they purchased everything. They had to certify that they had acquired enough instructional materials, whether they were cobbling it together or buying it from one source, that all of the TEKs were covered. It made the SBOE's process of textbook review a little less, quite a bit less important from a school district context. So then there are some, what we think, anecdotal and possibly causal observations of this policy framework. Over time, what at least I have seen, I've done a ton of school visits, is I've seen a variety of deployment scenarios in terms of how districts are actually managing this instructional materials landscape. And there's really not any one framework. You got 1,200 school systems, they're all doing it a little bit differently, but there are definitely patterns. And so the pattern that seems to be most common is the district will centrally adopt a scope and sequence. The district will centrally adopt a unit outline, and then they will convene teacher teams to develop the lessons and select the content resources, sometimes from curated district repositories, sometimes from anywhere. And so what this means is that teachers need a lot more planning time than they used to have, because they're engaging in a lot more lesson design activity than they did, say, pre-2011. And they're not consistently given that extra time, which means teachers often are faced with two full-time work weeks, so the 40 hours a week that they have to directly teach and the 40 hours a week that they have to design lessons, which is obviously untenable. And of course, then textbooks, the usage of textbooks are far less common today than it used to be. And I still walk into classrooms and see textbooks being used, but it's much rarer, and it's usually niche subjects. So some other things that have changed. Again, we talked about the impact on teachers. So teachers self-report a distribution of phenomena. So some teachers are like, I'm fine. I'm given plenty of planning time. Life is good. But about on average, teachers report that they spend about 7 hours a week, not planning per se, because planning can mean a lot of things, but literally finding lessons. So this is scouring the internet for lesson materials, finding content resources to include, because it hasn't been necessarily given to them. And they on average, they have about 3 hours and 45 minutes a week for all planning activity. And that all planning activity could include grading papers, could include calling parents, could include lesson rehearsal. There's any number of things that can go into a planning exercise. So what we have also seen is it would appear that the autonomy the districts have, they're using that to deviate pretty heavily from SBOE adopted materials, SBOE approved materials. So 72% of instructional materials adopted by LEAs in English language arts are not the SBOE approved materials, 61% in math. And those are what you would think of as operational observations of the policies over the last 10 years. There's also, what does this mean for kids? And so there's a variety of ways that you can measure student outcomes. A decent way, because it does it for every state the same, is the NAEP. And so these are NAEP average proficiency levels in fourth grade reading, fourth grade math, eighth grade reading, eighth grade math for the last 20 years. And what you see is that there was a real renaissance that occurred in Texas up to like from the mid 90s to the early or late aughts, where scores were improving for kids in Texas, which is great. That's what you want to see. The post 2011 picture is worse. Much of that gain has been lost. Now, obviously, COVID was a part of that. You can see the pretty significant downward trend, the 2019 to 2022, but like it's not isolated to COVID. This is a sort of long-term shift, and no one knows with certainty what is causing this. There's not exactly random controlled trials done on state policy making. It's not like, let's do this in Illinois and this in Texas. That's not how it works. But I think our conclusion is that the policy is in fact somewhat causal, that the shift away from textbooks and away from state oversight and consistency of implementation has caused an aggregate decline in student achievement in the state. So the legislature is doing all the same studying we're doing, and in the most recent legislative session, they passed House Bill 1605 as a result of all of this information. And so the high points of then what is in 1605. Well, this is specific to the legislative agenda of the SBOE. The SBOE has wanted its authority restored since 2011. These were three of their legislative asks related to their legislative agenda, and these three asks were probably on their legislative agenda every single session since 2011. But 1605 really addressed their legislative agenda in a pretty comprehensive way. So what does 1605 do? This is a bullet list. It's a 50-page bill. I have to imagine that everybody that is attending this publisher call has probably read the bill. So this isn't everything that's in the bill, but sort of the high points of what is in there. It significantly expands the SBOE's legal authority in terms of how they review instructional materials, and it requests TEA to manage a process underneath the SBOE's oversight to help them do the instructional materials review. It created these two formula incentives, $40 a kid and an additional $20 a kid related to SBOE approved instructional materials. And those are per year, and it's now part of the foundation school program. So it's not a grant. It's actually not subject to appropriation. It's an entitlement. Just like if a new kid rolls up, you get $61.60 the basic allotment, you get $40 for buying instructional materials that are SBOE approved. There was a statutory provision that linked a sort of an 8-year cycle to instructional materials adoption that seemed to imply an 8-year cycle to TEKS review. That has been repealed. There was a statutory provision that required the SBOE to approve anything that had more than 50% TEKS coverage. That has been repealed. Districts are given an exemption from state contracting law if they are buying on the SBOE list, and that will be of relevance to, I think, this audience significantly, because what is setting up is we negotiate with you on the SBOE's behalf, sign the deal, and then everybody's in. So it's a sort of common approach to procurement to then allow districts to save all that paperwork time. Again, publishers have to have parent portals that allow parents to navigate their instructional materials for districts that are using their instructional materials. There is a local curriculum review process that is established, and there's a grant that is provided to school districts to cover the cost of that process. We're a couple of years away from those, or at least a year away from that being stood up. I think the team will talk about that in a bit. And districts can administer that, like they can ask for that on their own, but there's also a parent request provision there. As I mentioned before, the SBOE has to add a word list and a book list to the English language arts and reading TEKS in all grades. The teachers have been given some additional time protection for themselves. So as I mentioned before, there's 3 hours and 45 minutes a week on average that teachers are given. And statutorily, I think it says 450 minutes every 2 weeks. Does that sound right, Todd? And so there's language in there that says a district cannot require a teacher during that time specifically to design lessons from scratch, unless they sign a supplemental duty agreement with the teacher. And so that was a pretty key recommendation we got from teachers from the Teacher Vacancy Task Force. And so the legislature heard that and implemented that in 1605. There is an old statute that's called the Open Education Resource Statute. It's been around for a while. That confuses some people, but it basically is a shorthand for intellectual property owned by the state that can be changed in perpetuity. So there's a directive for TEA using that statute to build out textbooks that are owned by the state in a few grades and subjects. There is a training program that is an optional training program for districts that want to use those state-owned textbooks, since there is no sort of company that districts can go to for that independently. And then 3Qing has been prohibited in literacy instruction. For everybody that's on this, if you have not heard that podcast, Sold a Story, and you're in the publishing industry, you should listen to that podcast. So highly recommended. Sold a Story. So I think that significantly influenced that particular piece of statute getting added to this bill. So anyway, so that was what was in the bill writ large. So now we're going to go deep on this first area of the bill, which is the instructional materials review and approval process. And I'm going to turn it over to Todd and switch places so you're a little closer to the microphone. There we go.
All right. And you have side control on that one too, if you want to.
I do. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hi, I'm Todd Davis. I'm the interim associate commissioner of instructional strategy, and we're going to do a deeper dive on basically on the three different actions or requirements that are outlined on this particular slide. The commissioner gave us the cliff notes. That previous slide is probably the best summary of 1605 out there, and I've tapped into that slide many times, and I would recommend you do the same. But we did determine that these three key actions or requirements of the 1605 relative to new SBOE authority is probably the most relative or relevant for today's conversation. We're going to dig into each one of these.
It's not going to be easy for him to do that.
I can do it, yeah.
Ready?
Mhm.
What do I need to do?
I don't think you can control, not even.
You're good.
You
I'll
got
do
it.
it for you.
All right, so we're going to start with IMRA. So thinking in terms of the new State Board of Education authority, 1605 has given the State Board of Education the authority to define high quality for instructional materials, to identify high quality instructional materials, and to adopt high quality instructional materials. IMRA is the process that's going to guide the SBOE into fulfilling that requirement. So IMRA provides, well, actually there's criteria that is provided through 1605, and the criteria is listed on this slide. What will be built out utilizing this criteria or the standards relative to this criteria. Most of the standards will be in the form of a rubric. Many of the standards will be in the form of a compliance statement as where it's most suitable. In addition to that, there will be a process for which materials will be reviewed. Both the standards relative to the criteria, the rubrics, and the process will be ultimately approved by the State Board of Education. When those two functions are approved, that will initiate the review of materials ultimately for the State Board to adopt. So again, to recap this is the standards to identify quality instructional materials, the process, to define high quality for instructional materials, the process to identify high quality instructional materials, and then the requirement to approve high quality instructional materials. Now, once high quality instructional materials are approved by the State Board of Education, then as the commissioner stated, that unlocks additional IMA funding that districts can access. But again, it's important to know districts cannot access that additional funding until SBOE approves high quality instructional materials. Now, in relation to, or more information regarding the IMTA or IMA, funding. So as the commissioner stated, the IMA funds were restored to HB1 traditional levels, approximately $1 billion per biennium. 1605 provides two additional entitlements relative to the State Board of Education approving high quality instructional materials. Now, looking at the logistics around these allotments, as you can see, the 24-25 biennium is a significant increase from what was allocated to districts in 22 and 23. So that is one very positive result of 1605. But in addition to that, the additional funds, now as a previous chief academic officer, this is where I really focus my attention right here. That the additional funds that are now available to districts, if they choose to adopt materials on the state board approved list, is $40 per student for the purchase of those materials. Now, in addition to that, if a district chooses to adopt the state developed or state owned OER product, there is an additional $20 that is provided to the district. So if a district does choose the OER product, they will have access to the $40 and the $20 for the purchasing of those materials. Now, the timing of the allocations, as you can see, the instructional materials and technology allotment is a biennial distribution. That it's important to differentiate from the $40. As you can see, that is an annual distribution, as is the $20. Now, what's important also to note is, do these funds carry over? Traditionally, as we all know, the IMA does carry over from year to year, and it does accrue, as will the $40. That will also accrue from year to year and will be available for districts if they choose at some point to access or approve, or excuse me, adopt the materials on the state board approved list. The $20 per year for the OER purchases, that is only available when the district makes the decision to adopt the OER, and is only used to the extent that it's needed by the district. It's not a full $20 distribution. It is used in accordance to the need of the district. The allowable use of the funds, when it comes to IMA, the allowable use has not changed from previous allowable actions. The $40 per year, that is, again, as we've stated, that is to be used for purchases of the state approved instructional materials. And of course, the $20, as I stated, is for the OER product. Now, the process to approve instructional materials in the past, as the commissioner said, it was an 8-year cycle for proclamation that involved typically the review of instruction, or excuse me, the standards that resulted in review of new materials, district adopting new materials, implementation of the materials, a timeline that typically spanned 6 years. Now, with the advent of 1605, that 6-year timeline is condensed significantly. And as you can see, 1605 allows the SBOE to review instructional materials independent of a TEKS change. Typically, materials were reviewed always corresponding to a TEKS revision, or I could say vice versa. TEKS were revised corresponding to the 8-year cycle of the proclamation. And what now 1605 provides authority to the SBOE to review materials at any time that they feel it is appropriate. But using the ELAR process, materials will be reviewed on a yearly basis until all courses, all subject areas are reviewed, and it has an approved list for every course, every subject area is identified.
I'll chime in here too, because if I think from a publisher's perspective, this is a fairly important distinction from past practice. Within a year, the SBOE will be going through some process of reviewing, let's call it elementary math textbooks. And so a variety of publishers will submit and say, like, please review my textbooks. And some will get approved, some might not get approved. The next year, the same rubrics that were used the former year, same standards, everything else, it's just open again. And so if someone doesn't submit in the first year, once a grade and subject has been opened up by the SBOE, we would anticipate that we just always accept submissions from publishers from that point forward in that graded subject. So if the timing of your product development doesn't happen to mesh with submission in 1 year, you submit the year later. Or if you submit in a year and you get rejected, you can make changes to it, come back and try again, the following year or 2 years later, whenever it is that your changes are done. So this allows, if there's a new entrance to the marketplace that didn't have it up and running when the TEKS were revised, they can submit. So this annual review cycle gives publishers options, just like it gives the SBOE options to sort of tap into this review framework. So that is again a big break from past practice, because it used to be that the SBOE gave you one shot right after the TEKS were revised, and if you didn't make it, that was the end of your shot. And that's it is theoretically now a different landscape.
It certainly gives flexibility to school districts as well, knowing that process will be happening annually. So to look a little bit deeper at both the criteria and the process, if we want to focus first on look at the first blue graphic, that's really key to how this process is initiated. The SBOE has to give us the indication of what materials should be reviewed and at what time throughout this process. So at this point, we and I will give this information later in the presentation. Our ask of the SBOE was, what are the materials? What are the subject areas and the grade bands that will be in this first batch of review? So when the materials are determined by the SBOE for whatever cycle of review, then we move to the first orange graphic, and that is the development of the criteria the requirements in relation to the criteria, the rubrics, the compliance statements that I mentioned earlier. Those are the standards in which materials will be reviewed against. Then we move into what is the process for the reviews. So you look at the materials will be made available for public review, and then a very extensive review process will be employed, utilizing content area experts, teachers to provide reports to the SBOE in relation to the requirements and the criteria, ultimately making recommendations to the SBOE to then allow them to deliberate and then to approve or reject materials. Ultimately, then that moves into the determination of pricing, details on terms and conditions also will all come into play then in order to ultimately define what is a high quality instruction material in the state of Texas. Here's another overview of the criteria in which standards or rubrics will be developed. I think this is really important for a publisher here. You look at each one of these will have different types of standards and rubrics that will be determined. First of all, the standards alignment percentage. As the commissioner mentioned, the SBOE now has the authority to go back in and review the percentage of standards that should be covered in a material to determine whether it's high quality or not, and that is likely to go up significantly. In addition to that, there will be quality reviews, quality rubrics that will be developed in relation to one, standard proficiency, and that is going to be looking at setting standards to how well an instructional material provides all students, access to and ability to be proficient in the standards. In addition to that, the quality review will provide an instructional design review. So the instructional design in relation to the cognitive research, in relation to the research-based instructional strategies, but also what's very important is the instructional design of the materials provides access to all students to engage in the content. That supports teachers in their ability to internalize rather than to develop lessons. It's critical in relation to the requirements that come out of 1605 that those opportunities of supports for teachers and students are clearly defined in the rubrics for instructional design and quality. And then, of course, there will be suitable and appropriate standards. There'll be standard statements that will define suitability and appropriateness, content level rigor, complexity of text, appropriateness into obscene or harmful in nature. Very critical that the materials do meet the suitable standards. There will be a revisiting of the factual error expectations, And then ultimately, there will be clearly defined compliance requirements around the physical and electronic specifications of the materials. And then, of course, as the commissioner mentioned, the parent portal requirement for each publisher. All parents must have access, full transparency access to the instructional materials. Now, we're going to go into a timeline. We have 3 slides that are going to take us through the timeline for the EMRA process. We're going to go high level and we're going to try and dig in deeper to more near-term timelines. First of all, as you can see, the timeline for the EMRA process takes us through a span from right now, today, as we're sitting here today, to 2029. Beginning right now, we are in the process of having discussions with, and there'll be discussions among the SBOE in terms of what will the standards in relation to the content look like, and what is the defined process. The goal is to have the SBOE approve the process and the criteria for the EMRA in 2024. I'll get into more specificity around that, which will then launch or initiate the first review of instructional materials. And the hope is then adoption of the first batch of instructional materials in relation to the EMRA process, in relation to the state board's authority, will be finalized, that first batch in 2024. From there, we move on to adding in new subject areas. So the state board will then determine what subjects will come next, what grade levels will come next in the next batch, corresponding rubrics that are, because many of the rubrics will be, not only will there be standard requirements that will cross all content areas, but there will be, of course, very content specific standards that will be written into the quality. So that means that quality rubrics will need to be redefined, reshaped every year as new content are identified by the board.
For new grades and subjects.
For new grades and subjects, yeah, thank you very much. And then the EMRA process will then continue. What's important to note as we look at 2027, and I'm going to get deeper into this, is the EMRA process now will include ELAR again in relation to the addendum and the TEKS as a result of the new vocab and novel list. I'm going to get deeper into that in a few slides. And then, as you can see, through 28 and 29, EMRA process continues with the hope that we will have all subject areas, grade bands, courses. I want to make sure my terminology is correct. Have resources that are determined high quality, approved by the State Board of Education, and then, of course, opportunities for district to unlock those funds for whatever subject areas that they choose, all in relation to the list of approved high quality instructional materials.
So before you get into the details of the next 24 months, because this question has come up a bunch from different publishers in different grades and subjects. So towards the tail end of our conversation with the State Board last month, we asked, do they have a preference as to what we start with? Because we can't do everything all at once. There was an initial preference expressed, so we've been working internally along the lines. But the theory is that K through 3 phonics are related to that K through 5 ELAR, K through 12 math, K through 12 science all happens first, which is those would be the reviews that would occur during 2024. Let's say that you're a publisher in the room and you have a social studies product. That means nothing's happening for you in 2024 on EMRA. It's just not. What would happen theoretically is during 2024, while the reviews are underway in math, elementary, English, and science, the quality rubrics would be stood up for, say, social studies and other subjects. And then in 25, not only will we re-review anything that didn't get reviewed in elementary ELAR, math, and science in the first year, but we will then start reviews for social studies and so on and so forth. And I'm saying social studies as an example. I actually don't like we need to wait until the SBOE makes a decision. But that I get this question from time to time. We get this question from time to time, like, when will this begin relevant to us? When will our company, when will our product be eligible for the extra $40 a kid? And so it simply depends on the sort of rollout schedule for materials. So I wanted to surface that before we left the slide, and I see a hand come up on that subject, so far away.
Is it appropriate?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, you mentioned science would be next year. And proclamation 2024 science is happening now.
Yeah.
How is,
Yeah, so science is the most complex one to talk about because it's going to require you to like think about two things simultaneously in your head. So the existing proclamation process is totally unaffected by this law. So everything that was in proc, what was
2024.
Thank you, 2024. It just keeps on keeping on. So that science, I think it happens to be a few CTE things too. I can't remember exactly.
Technology application.
Tech apps.
Yeah.
So those all keep on keeping on, which is fine as long as you liked old law. The problem is old law doesn't give you the extra $40 a kid. And so once we finish the proclamation process under old law, all works just as it did as old law. People will know it's approved by the SBOE. They use their IMA on it, but they don't have access to the $40 a kid. So knowing science in particular just went through this, the thought process is, well, let's as quickly as possible do like whatever we can to do that IMRA full IMRA process for science, so that then once that's done, we can turn on $40 a kid for the science materials. Now, I think the challenging thing is just because you got approved under the proclamation or didn't, doesn't mean you'll land the same way under the IMRA process. It kind of depends on what is the rubric that the SBOE adopts. Is it the same as, for many of you who are doing this now, you're familiar with the TRR rubric. If it happens to be the same thing, then we're actually going to be done before we start. But if it's not the same thing, it's not the same thing. And then there's other components of this IMRA process besides the quality components. There's the suitability review as well that we would anticipate the board will adopt a suitability rubric and would apply that in addition, which has not been done previously. So anyways, that's why science is happening again. I think in an ideal world, it's just a very fast version of analogous to what has happened during the proclamation process, but they are in fact two different statutory frameworks, so we have to run it again.
I think it's important to note too that if your product doesn't land on the SBOE high quality list, that doesn't necessarily prohibit a district from purchasing. They still have their IMA funds that could be used for that with board approval, of course, to move forward on it. Local board approval. Yeah, but what we're of course moving towards is that creating that list so that districts can, as the commissioner said, as quickly as possible unlock the additional funds if they choose to do so.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Just a quick question. So when you go through that process, the $40 may not be available. But let's say science wasn't. So it wouldn't be available for science. It all got approved in 2024, but it'd still be available for Phonics.
That's correct.
There's not like an additional $40.
No, it's not 40 by subject area. It's 40 by kid for the district to spend however they need to, given the instructional materials needs they have locally.
If something is approved in 2024 under the new IMRA process, then the districts have that $40 to spend on whatever it has.
That's true. And if so for those that were remote, you probably couldn't hear that. He said that even if science weren't on the initial list of materials that get IMRA'd, I guess that's gonna be a thing. So whatever materials end up getting approved during 2024, districts have new money to purchase whatever those materials are. The one other thing that I would highlight for you initially, the first year approval is unusual for a variety of things. The money is already flowing. Well, as of September 1st, will already be flowing. So districts just accumulate $40 per kid in their bank account when we're going to manage this through EMAT. So it'll be managed just like the instructional materials allotment. They just can't spend it on anything. So the next year, they get another $40 added to it. So actually their first year of purchases that they can make, they will actually have $80 per child waiting for them to purchase whatever they wish to off of the SBOE's adopted list.
And again, to build on that too, that if a district isn't ready in 2024 to adopt anything, that money continues to build. and will be available for them when the timing is right for the district and whatever the context
Yeah.
is for adoption of.
I mean, theoretically, if the district did not want to purchase anything on the SBOA list for 10 years. And 10 years from now, there is a newly approved material that the district now wants to begin spending resources again against. At that time, they have $200 a kid to purchase. It just continues to accumulate.
Hey, Commissioner, thanks. Quick question with regard to not process, but again, subject matter and replacing the proclamation, obviously, in the timing of what subjects beyond the first tranche that you're talking about. Is that triggered by the state board in terms of what they recommend to you in terms of the next call, for example, non-foundation subjects or
That's right.
enrichment subjects?
Yeah, the question was who can, I'm gonna paraphrase. The question was who controls which subjects get prioritized? And so, again, what we would anticipate is once a set of criteria have been developed for a given grade and subject, it becomes sort of an evergreen review. Every year, like, so you didn't get in the first year, we'll just reevaluate new applicants each year thereafter. But because we can't start everything all at once, we have to figure out what is the order that we want to go through for the next 3 or 4 years. And that's why you see the sort of next 3 or 4 years are where this policy becomes sort of most important for the SBOE to decide. After that,
So rubrics for the enrichment for those.
That's right.
that have not yet been called would not be contemplated until the state board.
that's right.
Correct.
So one thing, it would be logical for foundation subjects to happen before enrichment subjects, and then for enrichment subjects to happen. And then there's a distinction between full subject tier 1 materials versus supplemental subjects. So the bill authorizes supplemental subject review as well. So, but I would imagine we're not going to get around to that until we sort of, it's just like you got to crawl before you walk kind of thing. So
Right.
once, but literally once all the subjects are opened up, rubrics have been built for everything, then probably the triggering condition will be if the TEKS change. Because if the TEKS change in a grade or subject, then clearly the statute actually says it within, like, what the SBOE then has to redo everything at that point to make sure that schools have access to aligned instructional material.
And I anticipate that many of I would say majority of the rubrics, there is going to be commonality, a common thread through each in terms of quality. There will be specificity in terms of subject requirements. But as the commissioner stated, once all the rubrics are developed, then the 3 things that the board has authority to do: define, identify, and adopt. The definition will be out there. Definition will be a standard that is set. And then year to year, as just reiterating what the commissioner said, the opportunity to continue identifying and it's continuing to approve will be available to the board. Is there any other questions?
I'm sorry.
Oh.
Go ahead in the back.
Yeah, y'all plan to start with the TRR rubrics as a base, or are you gonna start from scratch? Or is that up to us?
So it's a great question. One of the reasons why we asked the SBOE what subjects do they like to start with is because we have to draft rubrics and then give them to the SBOE for their review, discussion, consideration, approval. And so you have some TRR rubrics in some grades and subjects. You don't have some TRR rubrics in other grades and subjects. I think given our internal deliberations, the commissioner's responsibility is to draft some stuff and put it in front of them. So we've started those internal conversations. The TRR is definitely a starting point for our internal discussions because it's a known thing that's out there. That doesn't necessarily mean that what we will be putting in front of the SBOE will match the TRR rubric, because it's sort of what have we learned since a rubric has been out for X number of years, or like science is obviously brand new. So it's not like we've learned much from that one, but some of the other ones have been out for a while. So I think the short answer is yes, but don't necessarily expect it to be precisely the same, because I think we're trying to use this opportunity to do our best thinking as to the clearest way to define quality.
One more question on that. Is there anything that triggers a TEKS review then, if that's what triggers?
No. So the question was, is there anything that triggers the TEKS review? So there's no specific statutory mechanism to trigger a TEKS review. That is the discretion of the state board. So if you imagine state board policymakers, that maybe they get feedback from educators that this standard is unclear or is seemingly confusing. They get feedback from publishers that the standard. We don't even have design lessons for the standard. They could also be looking at student outcomes information. And so if there's student outcomes data statewide in some area that seems to be anomalously low, perhaps that's worthy of additional review. So I think rather than being governed by a clock, they will start being governed by sort of evidence and insight related to the standards themselves.
That was really mine. Just, I mean, honestly, thinking about math, that was that next proclamation 2026, which means those standard revisions would start next year, even the revisions, that's all.
So it's up to the SBOE as to whether or not they wish to do that and how. And I'm sure y'all pay attention to SBOE deliberations, but there have been discussions about math. There were a lot of discussions early in my tenure about math, and ultimately no action was taken. So some of those discussions have resurfaced recently. So I don't know what they're going to decide. Wasn't there a question over here? Okay. Okay.
So we know that the SBOE made a decision that worked for you, and you mentioned that, and it came from Phonics, et cetera. So when will those materials, when can we submit those to TEA for review?
So she asked a couple of things. She asked the SBOE had a discussion about prioritizing grades and subjects in this first batch of reviews. When will those reviews start? When can publishers submit for those reviews? And I think now is a good time.
We're gonna get into that. And appreciate the questions. Very thankful the commissioner decided to stick around. With those questions.
I don't know that I'll stick around for the whole.
No, please sit down. Okay, so looking at this is the timeline, and I think we'll answer your questions, but looking at near-term timeline, focus their attention on the calendar, the spectrum of the months and the years at the bottom of the slide. Focus in on the first, there's two X's that we're going to focus in on here. The first X, April 2024. That is our goal for rubrics and process to be developed and presented to the SBOE for approval.
With just a slight clarification on that. Full approval. So they would have seen it before then, but we got to get started in April.
That's right. So I was going to backward map from there. And so as you can see from that point, there will be a lot of discussion with the SBOE, discussions with the SBOE in getting to that final approval. But our goal is to have April of 2024 be that point of where rubrics and process are defined, are approved, then that will initiate the review process. And then moving forward 6 months, a 6-month timeline to review materials against the rubrics is an ambitious timeline with a goal of SBOE approving high quality instruction materials in November of 2024. And that's that second bullet. From that point forward, then that gives districts the opportunity with the defined high quality instructional materials list for the first batch of subject area and grade bands, districts to make decisions on whether or not they want to adopt from that list. That unlocks the opportunity for the $40 or the $20 districts to start receiving the textbooks, and then for implementation of the high quality instructional materials in 25-26.
So your question specifically about when do you submit? So in theory, all the things necessary to define the process have been formally codified and adopted by the SBOE by the April board meeting. Maybe some of it's adopted before, but certainly by the April board meeting. So theoretically, there is an open call for people to say, please review me sometime in and around April. Could be actually earlier than April. Because ideally then by April, we would know these are the first batch of products that will be reviewed. And so then right after the April board meeting, the review teams get to work.
Right. And that's part of the process that's still to be determined. But at least this gives you some markers to start planning around.
And it's possible that we would, pending conversations with the SBOE along this process, potentially open up in January, for example. You can imagine like a submission thing open up on our website that says, you know, I'm a publisher, I like my materials reviewed. So you start getting on the list, as it were, that first calendar quarter of 2024 in anticipation for in April, everything's formalized and we start executing.
So there wouldn't be any anticipation of schools using these funds for the 24-25 school year. that correct?
No,
Yeah,
no.
it's sort of if they are not currently using someone's product that happens to be approved in November, then how could they start spending money in November for a school year that already started? But it's possible that they are currently using products and that end up getting approved. And if that's the case, then if they have any orders that need to be processed that year, they could use it that year. It's just sort of but I think it's best to conceptualize the 25-26 school year, not the 24-25 school year.
Yes, assuming that the majority of orders are placed during the next season.
That's right.
Right.
If districts choose the OER, do they have earlier access to any of the funds?
No,
The question is if districts
thank you.
choose OER, will they have earlier access to the funds? And no, because the OER has to go through the same EMRA process as all products. So availability of the 40 and the 20 for OER will not be available until the OER is approved by the state board. Okay. All right, now here are some of the key decisions that, in the presentation to the SBOE, key decisions that were laid out for them. Of course, first of all, was the advice on the first content areas to be reviewed, and we've gone through that already. Before materials reviews can begin, here are some of the key decisions that need to be made around the EMRA criteria. These are the standards, the rubrics that I mentioned earlier, setting the minimum TEKS percentage. They have to approve the quality rubrics that's this process that, our discussions with and among the board and to bringing us to the quality rubrics, the suitability rubrics need to be adopted, re-adopt the factual error definition. Now getting into the EMRA process decisions the board has pending, approving the material selection rules. So they have to determine what are the content areas and the grade bands that are going to be in each batch. But then after that, what are the rules for the prioritization and the order in which materials will be reviewed? Also looking at procedural rules, adopting public review requirements. And then very important for publishers at the bottom of the slide, the decisions around final approval regarding physical and digital materials, the parent portal requirements, and then adopting standard terms and conditions. And that leads us into the next slide. The state board now has an authority to develop standards and conditions authority. Contracts for instructional materials have traditionally been executed between the state board, as the commissioner mentioned, and publishers on behalf of the LEAs. 1605 authorizes the board to impose standards and conditions for publishers independent of textbook contracts. And as you can see, some of the terms and conditions that the SBOE may determine that need to be imposed are listed here on the screen. Basically, what this is saying is this is in regard to the flexibility of SBOE in terms of the review of materials, how materials, then the agreements between the SBOE and the publisher. And if there's any color you want to add to this, Commissioner. Again, what's important to note, though, that as contracts expire, there will not be a need to reissue. You can see that last sentence on this slide. A new proclamation for the sole purposes of extending contracts. It's important to note moving forward.
I think we had a question in the chat that asked if a material is on the approved list, how long does it stay on there? Current process before House Bill 1605 was the 8-year cycle plus an extension. Once material is approved by the board, it stays on the list until the board would choose to remove it, or if they modify the TEKS and determine that that change would require a change in materials. So this piece of the bill decouples the need to have a termed contract. So the board has flexibility to adopt and approve materials through this new process without the 8-year time constraint.
There are other SBOE rulemaking processes that need to be that are needed as a result of HB 1605. Most of the rulemaking decisions will be incorporated into the EMRA criteria and the processes that we've already discussed. Other rules outside of those decisions, the TEA staff will be in discussion with SBOE in the September meeting. Digging deeper into the TEKS review and revision, as mentioned already, the statute requires a new vocabulary and book list of addendum to be developed in accordance with the ELAR standards, and also gives, as we've mentioned, the flexibility of the SBOE to review TEKS, the review and revision schedule. So getting deeper into the ELAR vocabulary list, the statute states that the SBOE shall provide a required vocabulary list and at least one literary work for each grade level. The process to initiating this vocab list and novel list must be initiated by February 1st, 2024. Now, looking at the long-term timeline, the implications of this requirement. Now, first and foremost, this will become added to the ELAR standards as an addendum. It's a very important thing to note, and think about that in terms of that relationship to the new standards around the TEKS coverage that will be developed and determined by the SBOE. But looking at this long-term timeline, as you can see, this takes us all the way to 2029, beginning with right now, where we sit today, initiating the process for the initial draft for the ELAR addendum, the vocabulary and the book list. Moving into 2024, having a TEKS review work groups who begin to develop the addendum. 2025, that ELAR TEKS addendum is adopted, and then a proclamation to publishers to prepare for the IMRA process for ELAR. So here we have the new additions of the ELAR standards through this addendum. And the IMRA process will then need to be initiated once again. Publishers will have in 2026 the opportunity to revise the ELAR materials in relation to the addendum. 2027, the IMRA process will then be conducted and new materials for ELAR will be adopted. Again, in relation to the TEKS addendum for the vocab and the book list. 2028 will be the first year for districts to implement those materials. And then you can see in 2029, that is when possible state assessments will be administered in relation to the addendum.
For those of you that have textbooks in the English language arts subject area, this could be quite substantive. The way the statute says it is these will be words that kids need to know in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade. So if you think about a TEKS coverage percentage, and if the goal is 100% TEKS coverage, and for whatever reason your product currently is missing 5 of those vocabulary words in kindergarten, then you're no longer going to have 100% TEKS coverage, and you'll have to find passages and other lessons to modify your materials to incorporate that all of those words are being taught in the material. And the same thing with the literary works list. How substantive this may be as a modification of existing products, it's hard to say. Don't know until you see the vocab list, the book list, and it may be like very substantive for 3 products and not substantive at all for another 3 products. It just depends on what knowledge is currently covered in those English language arts products.
Okay. Any questions regarding the vocab novelist? All right, moving on. Again, in relation to the key actions related to the TEKS flexibility, the board's authority for review flexibility. As we've mentioned, the prior law, the 8-year cycle has been repealed. I think we've talked through that quite extensively. The new law does give the SBOE the opportunity, the authority to review instructional materials for any subject area, even if TEKS aren't changed. However, if TEKS are changed, the SBOE must issue a proclamation for instructional materials and adopt materials by December 1st of the year before the TEKS come into effect. And that does take us back in relative to the addendum that we just mentioned for the vocab and the novel list. Yes.
So the SBOE can review new instructional materials for a subject each year, but they're not required to. So that kind of revolving door year to year that you mentioned previously is not necessarily a statute.
Yeah, I think so. The question was about the concept of like continuous review of instructional materials. Does the SBOE have to keep the door open every year? Not in the statute. They essentially have the flexibility to open it up and however they want.
And finally, let's look at the authority that the state board has around parent transparency. As mentioned, the SBOE will set standards and rules for a local curriculum or instructional materials review. Districts will have these rules at their discretion to develop their internal systems. And as mentioned, there will be grants available for districts to initiate and deploy these reviews if desired. And then in addition to that, requires publishers to make textbooks available through the parent portal. And there will be standards that will be set by the SBOE in regard to the requirements around the parent portal, but ultimately to have all resources available and that transparency clearly available for parents.
Is there much thought given to copyright concerns around the parent portal?
So the question was, there much thought given to copyright concerns around the parent portal? I think that's a question that's like a legislative question.
Sure.
So there are some provisions in there related to copyright law. I can't remember off the top of my head, but in somewhere in that statute that I don't have the statute in front of me. I'm sorry, but there is something in there related to the copyright that publishers have. One of the things to bear in mind about the parent portal requirements is there's not a requirement that anyone access your textbook anytime. It is the requirement that parents of students enrolled in districts who are your customers have the ability to access it. And so I think there's some concept of like imposing a an access restriction, like you gotta be a parent, you gotta be there, and you have to use when you're doing it, you got to do it for personal review. If you're posting our stuff on social media, or you're trying to copy all, I don't know, like posting it, like trying to copy the entire purpose to make your own product out of it, that is likely a copyright violation. So there's some sort of copyright protection thing in the statute. I can't remember exactly what it is. I'm sorry.
I guess and this again is for a legislative question, it's for you, but there becomes more complexity on the publisher side to keep up with that instead of it going through the school side, who already knows who all the teachers are, so data privacy laws and everything that's encompassed in that.
His follow-up question was related to the complexity of trying to identify parents as opposed to just work with school districts to sort of know who the parents are. I actually think that is also in the bill, because there's something in there that says the school districts have to tell the publishers who the parents are so they know who to gain access to. We don't know exactly what the SBOE is going to adopt, but my assumption is there's some sort of single sign-on provision that would be required in these portals to integrate with existing parent portals for like just looking at my kid's grade or something like that. If I log into a system and look at my kid's grade, why don't I click a link and then all the user verification stuff happens automatically then between the district and the publisher's portal.
All right, so on this slide, this outlines the SBOE's actions to improve parent transparency. So you can see the actions, the requirements of the SBOE on those first 4 bullets. But I think what's important to note is that the timeline, that in order for the materials to be determined high quality and to be added to that approved list by the SBOE, that the SBOE must adopt the new review rigor criteria, the petition process for the local reviews, in addition to the parent portal rules for IMRA. So that all needs to be specified and outlined at the same point when materials are being approved, all part of the approval process and identification of high quality. Now here's this is bringing together all the timelines that we've discussed so far. This is this is for your your review, but this is an overview of all the different key actions and decisions that the state board has and how their authority has changed and how that lines up in relation to one another. Now, as the commissioner stated, that the state board in the last work session or study session that we had with them did make decisions around what subject areas and what grade bands. The last 3 slides here were the slides that were put together to provide some context for the board in making that decision, to provide some guidance in that decision making. And I think much of it is what we've already discussed in terms of the timelines for proclamations that are coming up. But other information that was provided to the board were first and foremost that it is anticipated that roughly 200 sets of instructional materials can be reviewed at any given year. And that's when we talked about that very ambitious timeline, we needed to quantify how much material do we really feasibly believe can be reviewed in that timeline. And it's determined roughly 200 sets of instructional materials can be reviewed yearly. Now, taking that into account on the full scope of all instructional materials that may potentially need to be reviewed, when you look at the 4 foundational subjects, all 13 grade levels, that consists of 572 material, approximately. When you look at the enrichment subjects, that's an additional 467. And at this point, it's hard to get a count of all of the supplemental materials that may need to be reviewed. But given all those numbers and given the anticipation of 200 per year, we know that it will take multiple years to initiate the review of all grades and subjects. So that's, again, very important information that was presented to the SVOE when helping them through making that decision. In addition to that,
I would like to be done with the initial set of reviews in 4 total years. And for those of you who are not mathematics experts, that doesn't work because 200 times 4 is not 1,000. But we're learning and sort of thinking about how to structure the review processes to try to add an efficiency where we can add automation to get through this as effectively and as expeditiously as possible, so that by 4 years from now, the SBOE has had the opportunity to open up everything. And then they're just in sort of maintenance mode thereafter, or any new TEKS changes. That's at least my own personal goal for how we as an organization support the SBOE in this process.
and we know school districts are going to want us to get this done as rapidly as possible. To have, full discretion of all subject areas when I make, as a chief academic officer, when we're making decisions on how we want to use that $40 appropriately, I want to be able to have a much wider menu of options. And so expediting that for districts is exceedingly important.
I think that's it, right? So we might just.
Yeah, and so the last 2 slides were additional information that we provided the SBOE, but it landed in the subjects and the grade bands that we've discussed potentially as our first batch. Now, the final decision on those subject areas and grade bands won't be finalized until the quality rubrics are approved by the board in April of 2024. But we at least know the direction that we're going in. Yeah.
So one thing, y'all did get some staff to help you with this, correct? You're not
Yeah,
gonna
there's
rely on teachers to do all these reviews.
Actually, it's more complicated.
Yes.
Okay.
So again, part of the
Could you
process.
repeat that?
Fine.
Yeah,
Oh,
repeat
the
the
question was, did we get more staff to help with the review process? We're not going to just rely on teachers. Teachers will be a key part
Right.
of the review process. How the reviews will take place and who will be
All that's
reviewing is still to be
Okay.
determined.
It is likely not agency staff conducting any of these reviews.
Probably
Okay,
not.
so that was my next question.
It
Do you
is,
really think
these
that
are likely
ours will be
third-party
like
review
16?
teams.
Okay,
Yes.
because those of us, I think some of us have had experience with other states who have tried to do this, and one of the biggest detriments is it is sometimes 18-month, 24 months to get through an initial round of reviews to get any kind of feedback or anything back, because they just can't get teachers to
Well,
commit to do it.
we have to do it in 4 months or less.
Okay.
Because we're gonna start about April and we really need to give you feedback.
Yep.
In time to clarify, factual errors, whatever, other conditions. And likely in time for a good 2 board votes, like 2 board meetings.
Yep.
And if the board is gonna be able to take action by November and the reviews start in April, that we got only about 4 months to actually do the core of the review activity. And then there's sort of miscellaneous work that happens between the reviews finished and the board takes final action.
But what is certainly top of mind though, is we're designing the process is to design a process that can be done as efficiently as possible, but does not jeopardize quality.
This is
Integrity of the business.
developing a high degree of expertise in logistics is proven necessary in TEA for a variety of reasons, but this is one of those where we're gonna have to assemble a fairly large array of review teams that can work in parallel and get trained up to execute quickly. Yes, sir.
How are you gonna ensure that the third party has the expertise and the capacity
Yeah.
to do such a massive undertaking?
So the question is, how will we ensure that the third-party reviewers have the training and the capacity to conduct high-quality reviews
And
and
not-
maintain integrity?
Not necessarily even the teachers and training them up, I'm sure, but making sure that if there's a third party vendor that's running the say math review in 2024, that they're not relying on people who haven't taught math or have any sort of content area expertise or pedagogical knowledge in math teaching and learning as sort of a quality review part of that.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal question, and the answer to that question, I think, will become clear over the next about 5 months. Because the concept, if you go back to the chevron, the blue-orange slide for a second.
As we're doing that, I can tell you that very question is on top of our minds as well, as we're going and defining this process. Yeah. That doesn't answer your question, but
No.
it is a priority for us as well.
So when you so here you've got the nature of the process and the criteria. So we have to develop a rubric. How are you going to execute an evaluation in your case of a math textbook in your example? So theoretically, we will have defined well in advance, be very clear, public voted upon. This is the rubric that is being used to evaluate the quality of math. And the next question is, who are the people executing the rubric? And so this is this blue bar here. And so one of the things the SBOE has to do is they have to approve our review process. And that review process is not just use the rubric. It is, how did you select the reviewers? How frequently did they assemble? How is it, how many different reviewers are looking at the same product? Is there a process to do inter-rater reliability? So we're very familiar with concepts of inter-rater reliability, looking at open-ended responses.
What are the credentials of the reviewers?
That's right. What are their backgrounds? What are the required? What's the interview process that you go through with each reviewer? So that actually does, in fact, all have to be defined. How do we compensate them? Ideally, we use as many classroom teachers in that grade subject as possible that are in Texas. If we're doing it in the summer, we might be able to actually employ them on a full-time basis during the course of the summer. If you're doing it during the school year, you can't. There's all of these questions we do in fact have to answer, because this is the thing we got to put in front of the SBOE to get approved before we begin executing.
Yeah, and then on top of that, then how rubrics will be developed, but ultimately it's how clearly articulated are the rubrics. Do they have corresponding evidence guides, and how well articulated are those so that they can be agents of calibration across all of the reviewers?
We have lots of questions in the chat if we can share those. First one is around, how does House Bill 3 and the current Phonics rubric dovetail with this process?
It's a great question. So there's the concept of a full subject tier 1 material that was defined in the bill. There was a concept of supplemental materials that were defined in the bill, and then there was something called a partial subject tier 1 material. And the idea behind that partial subject tier 1 is it's not the entirety of, say, the English language arts TEKS. It is a portion of the English language arts TEKS. And so if you think about phonics specific instructional material, many of you have material that is phonics specific. It's not actually meant to be all of English language arts. It's meant to be phonics. And so the idea behind a partial subject instructional materials review is there's a subset of TEKS selected, and then materials respond to that, and they're designed to cover all of those very, very well at a high quality. In the discussion that we had with the SBOE, they prioritize not just K through 5 ELAR, but K through 3 Phonics. And so the agency has a Phonics rule that we have developed that we have authority under House Bill 3 to do. But you could theoretically comply with that rule, but not generate eligibility for $40 a kid of extra money. And so there will essentially be an SBOE process that will start, this April to review all of the Phonics specific materials as well. We anticipate that they will likely review all the same materials that we did initially, plus some of the materials we didn't get to in our initial review. And then they will create a formal approved list. And the idea behind the quality rubric, the minimum TEKS coverage, it's actually all statute that instructional materials needs to comply with. And so the Phonics rule as it exists will just be embedded in the SBOE's review process for Phonics instructional materials as part of that quality rubric. Hopefully I answered.
I think that answered. Yeah, it's only one way, but I think it did. Another question that we have in the chat is around since proclamations were repealed as part of 1605, will there be two processes continuing in the future, both proclamations and this IMRA process? Is it one process? Can you speak to the ending of proclamations and the start of the new IMRA process?
Well, I'll make an attempt at it.
The old process is repealed. So the old process is over, except for the fact that the Proc 24 is finished. So the proclamations as they have happened will not happen again. Instead, they will be the new IMRA process.
And if the board, now, maybe correct me if I'm wrong on this, and if the board does make a decision to revise TEKS at any point, in relation to that revision, there would be a proclamation in relation to the board's decision to make any revisions in the future.
That's right. So actually the word proclamation, if I remember correctly, wasn't in the old law. It didn't exist in statute. It was a concept. And so, but the statute that had it is gone. It's been replaced with a requirement that the SBOE, if they change the TEKS in a given grade and subject, if that change was substantive enough to warrant new instructional materials, then they are required to do, the same kind of proclamation you would, except it's the IMRA process. So develop the quality rubric, make sure you have suitability rubric in place, call for materials and evaluate them.
A couple more questions about just defining the scope, that it does include possible review of full subject instructional materials, partial subject instructional materials, and supplemental instructional materials, which did not all used to be under the purview of the board's review, but now does. And that your assumption is the priority would be on full subject foundational subjects first, but again, that would be up to the SBOE.
Yeah, I think those are both accurate statements. There's our understanding of the law is it allows the review of any kind of instructional material. There's some instructional materials that are specifically called out as being required, but the board appears to have control or the ability to review any instructional material they want. Then again, the order that they go through to deal with the 1,000 materials that are already out there, plus whatever materials the board has never looked at, is going to be a board decision that's going to be also influenced by just our capacity to execute.
What about LEA? So how much do they know about this? Kind of what training do y'all have? Is that all after SBOE once things are more, concrete? They know any of this is changing? We hear mixed messages from a lot of them.
So the question was, how well do LEAs understand the law and the changes that have happened? And there are 1,200 of them. So let's start with that. So I'm quite certain some of them understand it extremely well,
Yep.
and some of them may have not heard of the law yet. But we have not done I don't think we have done yet an LEA facing training on the changes of this law. I conduct a superintendent call every month. And so in the last 2 months, it's been sort of post-leg sessions. So we've been going over the highlights of a bunch of laws that have changed. And so there have been some discussions of this statutory change on each of the last 2 superintendent calls. We have sent them a link to this same PowerPoint PDF, this slide deck. They've all have access to this and have all been given a link to the actual 4 hours of the SBOE work session. You can imagine it's probably not on the top priority list of a superintendent to watch a 4-hour work session of the SBOE. So I don't know how many of them have seen this. In reality, the major impact that it's going to have on them is not going to happen until the SBOE's approved a new set of materials. And then they're going to be able to log into EMAT, and there's like a whole new set of money for them to spend against whatever has been recently approved. So I think the major LEA focused action is going to be after that. There's some asterisks to that. Because that supplemental duty agreement requirement in Chapter 21 of the Education Code takes effect, I think, in this school year. So those take effect. We generally don't send out notices related to that, but there's a lot of people that provide guidance to school districts when laws change.
And I'm sure there will be a strategic plan around the communication of this and a cascading way, in terms of, as Commissioner said, the superintendents, publishers, today's meeting is extremely important part of that plan. Then getting in front of chief academic officers, getting out this information as already stated, so that anyone can access this particular presentation. But most importantly, I think as a chief academic officer, the one thing that is important to know right now is that money is already flowing. That the IMA has been restored significantly. They all see their balances right now. They know what's, the parameters set around them. I think the biggest misconceptions that are probably out there is, when can we access the $40? And as long as we can get really tight on that, additional funding is not available until the state board adopts materials. Then that starts to put clarity around any of the misconceptions that might be floating out there.
There's just one more. I brought up the slide. There's one more set of questions around if a material is not approved in this new IMRA process, can districts continue to purchase any material using their instructional materials technology allotments? That would be the left-handed column on this slide. And the answer to that is yes. Districts are allowed to purchase materials that have been in previous proclamations and approved by the board. Those contracts still are in place up until proclamation in 2024. Those contracts will be in place, and districts will be allowed to requisition from those lists and also request disbursements.
And the contracts actually stay in place until the contracts end.
Correct.
So there's not new proclamations, but you can't abrogate contracts, so that those contracts stay in effect until they end. And the specific question, if on a go forward basis under IMRA, the SBOE formally votes to reject an instructional materials, you can't spend your $40 on it, but you can spend any other district money you want on that material. It's not a prohibited purchase.
I think the others we can address in a formal FAQ document, unless there's other questions in the room.
In previous processes, there have been a set aside timeline for publishers to see what the target is and have time to meet said target.
Yeah.
What are y'all thinking in terms of that?
Yeah, well, the goal would be to give you as much running room as humanly possible. So the question is, when does the rubric get adopted by the board, and when do the reviews get started? Back to the question I got earlier, how close is the rubrics that are common to stuff that publishers have seen before? I don't My guess is this first year is going to be far from ideal. That's probably the best way to answer that. And then back to the question that you asked earlier, the SBOE has the discretion to do these once a grade and subject's been established. Do you want to do it again, every year thereafter? And so theoretically, then somebody has as much running room as they wish to give themselves. Because if they don't want to, if they're not ready to apply in the first year, they can apply in the second or third, assuming it stays open. That may be a competitive disadvantage for publishers, but all we know is everyone will have access to it as soon as the SBOE approves it. You'll probably have access to it before then, depending upon how many edits come from an initial discussion with the SBOE to the final versions. You'll be able to see some of the stuff as soon as there's a first draft discussion with the state board, and then how much is the difference between that and the final adopted version. It's hard to predict. But again, once they are adopted, then they don't change unless something, the SBOE says, we think we've gotten some feedback on this one, we need to revisit it, but I would imagine that's going to be very infrequent. Much like teach changes would not necessarily be all that frequent either.
All right, so with that, we will formally close the webinar. Thanks everyone for joining. We will make this recording and the slide deck available, as well as a summary of the FAQs for folks who registered for the call. I'll have to see if we're able to post it on our website, but we'll check on that. So thank you everyone for joining, both virtually here and in the room.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank y'all for doing this.
I appreciate the question. It definitely helps us.